सबसे पहले मैं नफीसा शाह से दरख्वास्त करती हूँ कि ये जो हमारा सेशन है कन्फ्रंटिंग क्राइसिस वायलेंस अगेंस्ट वुमेन में पहला पेपर नफीसा का है और डायमेंशंस ऑफ फिजिकल वायलेंस ऑन वुमेन. Nafisa needs no introduction, we all know her. She is the chairperson of NCHT, she is an MNA, but above all she is one of our colleagues for one of our companions in the struggle for women's rights. Thank you.
And especially I'd like to thank Mani for getting me here. And I think it's very important that you come here again with your community of friends and colleagues, so you get a bit of a reality check and are rooted back into, so I think it's always a pleasure to come back to my family, and it has been very nice to meet my old friends and colleagues. I was asked to give a paper on violence against women, again in the context of this Beijing Plus 15 seminar that we are having. I really haven't, I must confess, I haven't come up with a separate paper. What I'll try to do is basically summarize the different things that I have been doing over the years on violence, and primarily my own research area, which is honor-based violence. And then the topic is dimensions of physical violence on women. But I will bring in one or two aspects of physics that I think are important to point out here, especially when we're looking at how to respond to violence. My work, for those of you who are not familiar with it, my work is primarily based in Upper Sindh. And I'm looking at honor-based violence, of course the custom of Karokari more specifically. And initially I looked at it as a journalist. I went and I did a story that was from the journalistic angle, and then I went into more an anthropological angle. So I looked at historical and social context within which this particular practice of violence was taking place. And then over the course of my research, I moved away from looking at it purely as a custom in a certain cultural context, and looking at it to see how the state and power is implicated in this particular practice. And I think this is a very important case study in the sense that it also brings in other factors, and then one can generalize it into some theoretical approaches to understanding issues of violence against women, especially in Pakistan. Now, obviously, if you Karokari is understood, or honor-based violence is understood as a cultural form of violence, and my argument is that it's not just enough to say it's a cultural form of violence because you don't explain anything, because culture itself can be deconstructed, and many things can be put into culture. So it's not enough to say it's culture, and it also doesn't explain why this practice persists. So in order to understand the dimensions of this kind of violence, you have to look at other factors. And I basically then went into looking at trying to see not why it's taking place, but why it's taking place with impunity. That means, how is this particular form of violence against women being approached or being addressed by the state? Is the state considering that it's a violence against women, or is the state looking at it in other manners? And of course, in the data that I came up with in Upper Sindh, I looked at a figure of like in the 10 years that from 1996 onwards and 2005, I looked at the total number of cases that were taking place, and I looked at how they were being processed by the law. And the data tells me that at the trial court level, you have only 3% convictions in honor-based violence. So if you had a total number of 1,600 deaths, and these were actually physical deaths recorded these are not all the deaths that are recorded of men and women, mostly women, but of these 1,600 deaths, which were like physical deaths, there were as many accused or more accused, because accused are often more than one person, so you would have about 3,000 accused. And of that, you have only 3% convictions at the trial court, and I did not follow it up to the higher courts, but my assumption would be that 50% of those would also be bailed. So basically what we are saying is that this physical violence is not only occurring in a cultural space, but it's also occurring in a legal space, because the people are deemed innocent, not only within the cultural framework, but also within the framework of the law. And this then allowed me to conclude or to present the thesis, which is as follows, that that cultural violence resonates with law, and that law can equally provide space within which cultural violence can occur. Now, why I'm saying that is the other dimension that I looked at in this violence, that of all these cases that I looked at, I think more than 98% of these cases, of the women, not the men. Men is a different story when men get killed and women get killed. I don't know if I have to go into the context of explaining how Farooq takes place, because everybody knows, so I won't go into that. But 98 or 99% of the women who were being killed in their family home, and by the very people who, even by legal definition and by social definition, are protectors and guardians of women. So there were three categories of the people who were conducting violence against women. The first, of course, when women was married, the husband was the most frequent category. And when not married, then father and brother were the most frequent category. But even when she was married, sometimes even the brother was a very frequent category of the killer. So these were the three categories. So again, going by my, of course, one can go into this whole cultural argument of marriages and marriages happening within the family and so on in women's public-private space. But when you look at the law and how the law is shaped, you actually find that the existing law, and I'll of course go into, there have been of course a lot of legal reforms, and one must also acknowledge, as we're going into Beijing Plus 15 process, you also have to acknowledge that certain measures have been taken by the state. But still, as it stands, kin-based violence is shaped, again, within the framework of the law. The law seems to but to give space to kin-based violence. And that is because, of course, it started out, the law that I'm looking at particularly, one can also look at criminal procedure, and that also has a judicial process, because the Shariat court then asked that this be turned into a law, and then this law was passed in the subsequent years. And later on, then it was amended through the Criminal Amendment Violence 2004. And basically, we all know that this law allows the victims' relations to condone legally, to forgive or to pardon an offense. And there are different ways in which this happens. So it can happen through a waiver, or it can happen through the diyat, in which you get money, or you can pardon it completely by not taking any money. So there are several official ways through which a woman's murder is sort of normal. The same term that I'll use, Nazish's term, is that it's normalized in a way through the legal process. So interestingly, it is agreed upon by the law that yes, this killing has taken place, but that there is a recourse, and the victim's relatives can negotiate. Now, when it's a woman who's killed, obviously her husband, her immediate kin, her brother, father, husband, these are the heirs. These could be the heirs of the victim, brother, father, and these obviously would interestingly, they are the very killers who are pardoning. So the structure of the crime then resonates with the structure of the law. And what I say is that the killer and the person who pardons become mirror images of one another. And in practice, you see something very fascinating happening in practice. So, if a woman is killed, it becomes irrelevant who the killer is, because this can be, the brother can go to the prison or can say confess that I've killed my sister for honor value, and then the father is presented as the wali or as somebody who will become the witness and then will say that, oh, actually this never happened, or vice versa. So these are pure family categories, and then there is an intense collusion within which this happens. So again, so then it's not enough to say that this is something that's going on since centuries. I think it is being constantly renewed and constructed within the framework of our legal system, where the perpetrator and the person who pardons are mirror images of one another, and also the state, in a way, recedes and it empowers the private. So the negotiation is happening in the private space. Now, often I find a lot of judges coming out very radically with suo motu action, saying that this practice is the jirga is outlawed and it's not allowed and so on. But in the law, in the letter of the law, because there is a negotiating space for a murder, therefore a jirga is allowed by default. I mean, it is legally not illegal, because the parents can negotiate, or the victim's heirs can negotiate the price of a murder. So actually, in the letter of the law, a jirga is not illegal. So I don't know how judges are interpreting and saying jirgas are outlawed, so long as you have the category of the wali and so long as murder is compoundable. So the murder is a private offense. By defining murder as not an offense against the state and as a private offense means that you're empowering the people to negotiate. And that is basically my thesis, is that cultural violence is not, so there is a lot of ethnocentric, analysis of this particular practice. They say, oh, these are people who are rural, these are people who are jahil. But actually, the whole act of this violence is being played out in the courts, because these are all murders coming into the formal process. And the people who are being released are going through the formal process. And this formal process is highly sophisticated. It is based in a common law form. Of course, it has over the years the religious angle has come into it and filtered into it. So it is a modern law, even if it's framed in certain religious metaphors. It's still a modern law, and there is a certain proceeding within which this happens. So this form of violence then is not something which is happening in isolation in this cultural space that's out there, that's in the jahil space, that these people are doing it, and then these are all men who are cruel, brutal, and so on. No, it is something that is happening in a space that is formal. And this is the dimension of violence that I'm concerned about in Pakistan. I also want to talk about some other dimensions of this violence. I talked about the domestic space and the space that it happens in the family. There is also, of course, because it's honor-based violence, there's a moral domain, there's a moral dimension of this violence. And again, when we talk about Talibanization, there was a moral dimension of that particular violence as well, because that the religious angle was brought in. So this again makes it something very tricky to address when you bring in the moral dimension in that particular local context, because then people think that, oh, because this was an honor case, then this was allowed. Also, coming to the policy or the way the state law is formulated, there's a clear division between the public and the private space. So whereas the state is concerned with the public space, the private space is again with the family. And in the case of women, we all know that domestic violence. I am of course looking at domestic violence in rural societies as a form of karukari, but there's a lot of domestic violence in the urban spaces, whether it's stove burning or so many other acid throwing and so many other forms in which it occurs in different areas. But there is there too a clear dimension between the public and the private, and it almost seems as if it's happening in the private space, then the state thinks that it's not its direct role to intervene, and it's almost through an indirect mediation that the state enters and gives justice to women. But having said that, now, I think that the domestic violence bill, therefore, is a very, very radical bill, insofar as it allows the state, or it widens the space of the state intervention in the home. And it was very interesting that this is exactly the point that the Islamic Ideology Council took. They talked about this factor, oh now, you know, the ghar mein aake wo, how can they police ghar mein aake privacy, intrusion of privacy ka jo wo hai, wo leke aaye the. And therefore I think this bill, on the whole, it seems like a very, moderately worded, conservative, but I think in this particular, how it changes the whole concept of the public and the private, and it brings in the private into the public domain, I feel that this is a very radical bill, and something that changes a lot of things in the way the psyche of the formal judicial system and the formal justice system is constructed, and therefore I think this is something that we as rights organizations have to support and understand, and then also understand the alternative politics. Then that the concern is obviously that it completely shifts to power dimension, in the sense that a woman is then no more in defined as a citizen, is not a secondary citizen, and filtered through the male and filtered through the private and so on, but she is a person in her own right and can get access to justice even if she's at home. So from that aspect, it is something that it's a major shift in the way that this is taking place. There was a Criminal Amendment Act which tried to reform or change the Qisas and Diyat ordinances, and there they said that the wali wali now no more can be a wali if it's an honor-based crime. So that in a way there is a recognition that if it is a karo-khari killing, then we will not recognize any wali in that case. The wali, we will not give the power to the wali to mediate. But then again, if you are giving power to the wali in other murder cases and not this, then in actual fact you're not changing anything. So I think the law has to move slightly further up. I would say that there is a step ahead, but it's not enough. There still has to be a radical change in this particular, in the Penal Act, in the Penal Code, which defines laws against the body and makes everything negotiable through a price or through pardon. That has to change. So this were my general comments on this on dimensions of violence, and I think theoretically there have to be these shifts, and what is very important is for women to be recognized as persons in their own right, rather than be mediated through a tribe, family, or even state becoming a filter for women, or Taliban, a sense of power being enforced through women's bodies. So it's very important that women's autonomy is recognized, and therefore this whole talk about the rights-based approach. And there you do see certain shifts. You see this happening in a little bit in the domestic violence bill, but I think a lot more needs to be done, and we of course need to talk about changing the state law, and also then understanding that violence is not simply something that occurs in a cultural space as an everlasting category which has been going on for centuries, but it occurs in a very modern formal space. This is